Hello everyone. In recent years, the competition and influence between the United States and China has led to many unexpected events in the field of trade. Both sides have issued reciprocal punitive orders as if they were exchanging fire. Regarding diplomatic relations, if the US hates any country, China will increase cooperation with that country, with Iran being a typical example. Today we will explore why China is happy when the US imposes sanctions on Iran. To understand the origins, first we will briefly summarize the hostility of the US towards Iran. In 1953, the US and the United Kingdom supported the Shah of Iran in carrying out a coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh's government. The reason was that he had nationalized the oil industry, harming the interests of British companies. The US helped the UK because they were active allies in the Korean War. After the successful coup, the US treated Iran as an ally, increasing military aid and making them an effective arm to help protect security in the Middle East, where many US oil companies were operating. From 1967, the US provided Iran with a 5-megawatt nuclear reactor and some uranium material sufficient to manufacture nuclear weapons. However, the purpose of the transfer at that time was only to help Iran generate nuclear power. In 1979, the Islamic leader Ruhollah Khomeini led a revolution to overthrow the Shah, and the pro-American government collapsed, replaced by a new government that considered the US an enemy. Ruhollah Khomeini continued the nationalization of the oil industry and confiscated assets of foreign companies, including $5 billion from US insurance companies. Soon after, the Shah fled to the US for alleged medical treatment. Fearing a second coup attempt, Iranian citizens took US officials hostage at the embassy. President Jimmy Carter did not back down and immediately imposed sanctions on Iran, including freezing $12 billion in bank deposits and other assets in the US. This incident directly led to the deaths of 8 hostages and prevented Jimmy Carter from being re-elected for a second term. From 1980 to 1988, the US provided billions of dollars in aid and intelligence to help Iraq in the war against Iran, fearing that Iran would take advantage and seize oil fields in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait where US companies operated. In 1996, in response to Iran's nuclear program and their support for terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, and other resistance movements in Palestine, President Bill Clinton increased new sanctions including a ban on trade of goods and services between the US and Iran. He also prohibited investors from participating in Iran's oil industry. The ban was enacted for 5 years and would continue to be renewed if Iran did not change its position. There are many other reasons that made relations between the US and Iran hostile. The most concerning issue nowadays is the US accusation that Iran is enriching uranium to manufacture nuclear weapons. In reality, it was the US who provided Iran with a 5-megawatt reactor in 1967 to help them generate nuclear power. Whether they are manufacturing nuclear weapons is still unknown, but it is very likely since Iran has been isolated and threatened for decades. It is because of the uranium enrichment that Iran has faced numerous sanctions from the US and some EU countries. Most notably are policies targeting Iran's oil industry, like prohibiting transactions or investments in this sector. All aim to strangle Iran's economy, which relies heavily on oil revenue. So has Iran collapsed? The answer is not yet, but for many years Iran has had negative economic growth. They have survived because after enduring decades of sanctions, they learned how to adapt. They switched all transactions to other countries, most notably China. The trade relationship between these two countries began in 1979, which was also when the US and Iran became enemies. However, cooperation between them was still limited because Iran was oriented towards Western markets until 1996 when the US prohibited any companies from investing in Iran's oil industry. This forced them to gradually shift eastwards. At that exact time, the energy demands of China's industrial sectors were growing rapidly, so Iran met China like water meeting thirst. In 1997, China signed its first oil and gas exploration agreement in Iran. This agreement established projects worth billions of dollars in the South Pars gas field and Azadagan oil field. In 2000, Iran continued signing an $85 million contract with China National Petroleum Corporation to drill 19 new oil wells in southern Iran. In 2004, they reached a $120 billion agreement to purchase liquefied natural gas for 25 years. At that time, this was the world's largest natural gas purchase agreement. In 2007, China signed a $2 billion deal for developing 137 oil wells at the Yadavaran oil field in western Iran. From 2009 to 2011, as the US and UN increased sanctions due to Iran's nuclear program, most Western companies withdrew from Iran, opening up huge opportunities for China. They were happy because they no longer had to compete on bids and could purchase oil and gas at heavily discounted prices. In these 3 years, they continued activities worth $6.46 billion to develop new oil and gas fields. Since then, China has become Iran's biggest customer, with most imports coming from oil and gas. Although China had to reduce imports from Iran for a few years due to pressure from the US, overall they continued strengthening cooperation with deals worth billions of dollars. Since 2018, the US has imposed additional sanctions on third-party countries if they purchase oil from Iran, with the goal of reducing Iran's oil exports to zero. Under this pressure, China and some other countries had to reduce imports. However, according to information from Refinitiv, a global financial data company, China has used new tricks to circumvent laws. They could not abandon the huge investments over many years in infrastructure. For example, oil from Iran would be shipped to Malaysia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates before being imported into China. For Iran, China is the savior, providing them with stable annual revenue. Without this, millions would starve. As for China, they have access to abundant and cheaper oil and gas than other suppliers. All the US sanctions efforts seem to have failed.